I was born into a country where fear was not an emotion but a law. From the moment I opened my eyes, I learned that silence could save a life and words could destroy an entire family. My name is Jim. Not my real name, but a necessary shield for those who still live under the most secretive and unforgiving regime on earth. In my homeland, faith in Allah, private prayer, or listening to any religious message beyond state ideology is considered a crime worse than theft or murder. It is treated as betrayal. Our home was a small concrete apartment, barely large enough to hold my parents, my older brother, and me. The walls were thin, so thin that even a whisper felt dangerous. We were taught early that walls had ears, neighbors had eyes, and even children could be informants. Privacy did not exist. Fear lived with us like an invisible family member, always present, always watching. Every morning began the same way. My mother would clean the framed portraits of the Supreme Leader hanging in our living room before doing anything else. Dust on those images was considered an insult, and an insult could mean arrest. Loyalty was not just expected, it was enforced. At school, we were taught that our leaders were divine, flawless, and the sole reason we were alive. Questioning was not curiosity, it was treason. Yet reality contradicted everything we were taught. Outside our classrooms, hunger walked openly in the streets. People collapsed from exhaustion and starvation. During the years of famine, food became a rumor more than a reality. I remember chewing tree bark, collecting grass, and watching adults fight over scraps like wounded animals. The government called it a temporary hardship. But hardship does not bury children. My father worked long hours in a state factory that produced goods no one could afford. My mother divided her time between forced labor and compulsory political gatherings. At home, no one spoke freely. Even family conversations were filtered, measured, stripped of honesty. Fear had trained us well. Despite everything, my brother was different. He was older, thoughtful, and quietly brave. He believed truth should make sense. One winter afternoon, he returned from school with bruises on his face. His crime was simple. He had asked a question. If our country is the most prosperous in the world, he asked his teacher, why are people dying of hunger in the streets? That question echoed through our home like a gunshot. That night, my father beat him, not in anger but in terror. "Do you want all of us sent to the camps?" he shouted. My mother cried silently, covering her mouth so no sound would escape. That was the moment I learned that love could be swallowed by fear, and truth could become deadly. Years later, my brother disappeared. One night he was there. The next morning, his bed was empty. No explanation, no goodbye. My mother told me he had been sent to serve the state somewhere else. But her eyes told a different story, one of loss, guilt, and forced silence. That was the day something broke inside me. I did not yet know Allah. I did not yet know prayer. But I knew injustice, and in a land where even thoughts could condemn you, that knowledge was the beginning of a dangerous awakening. After my brother's disappearance, our home became quieter than ever. Silence was no longer just caution, it was survival. My mother stopped mentioning his name altogether, as if erasing him from speech might protect the rest of us. My father aged quickly, his shoulders permanently bent under a weight no factory labor could explain. I learned then that in our country, grief had to be swallowed whole, without tears, without mourning, without remembrance. At school, nothing changed on the surface. The same slogans were shouted every morning. The same lessons were repeated about loyalty, sacrifice, and obedience. But inside me, everything had shifted. I listened more carefully, not to believe, but to detect lies. The words of the teachers felt hollow now, rehearsed and brittle. When they spoke of abundance, I saw empty bowls. When they spoke of justice, I remembered my brother's bruised face. Fear sharpened my senses. I noticed how people avoided eye contact, how conversations stopped the moment a stranger approached, how neighbors smiled too quickly, laughed too loudly, as if enthusiasm itself were a form of armor. We were all acting in a play where the wrong expression could end everything. Hunger became our constant companion. Rations grew smaller, then irregular, then meaningless. My mother learned to stretch nothing into something, boiling water with a few grains of corn, pretending it was soup. My stomach ached constantly, but hunger was so common that pain felt normal. I watched children my age disappear from school, one by one, without explanation. No questions were allowed. Questions led to absence. I began working as soon as I was old enough, not by choice, choice did not exist, but by necessity. Labor was presented as honor, but it was punishment disguised as duty. Long hours, little food, constant surveillance. The body learned to obey even when the mind resisted. At night, lying on my thin mattress, I thought of my brother. Where was he? Was he alive? Had he broken under torture? Had he spoken my name? Those thoughts terrified me more than hunger. In our country, punishment does not stop with one person. Guilt is inherited. Crimes are shared by blood. That fear shaped my faith before I even knew the meaning of faith. I found myself whispering words into the darkness, not prayers, not yet, but questions sent into the void. Is there justice anywhere? Is there someone who sees this, someone who hears what we cannot say? I did not know Allah then. I did not know His names or His mercy. But something inside me was already searching. In a world where the state demanded absolute loyalty, my heart quietly refused. It longed for a truth that did not require fear to survive. Years passed like this, gray, heavy, indistinguishable. I grew into a woman hardened by routine and suspicion. Smiling less, trusting no one, carrying my brother's absence like a shadow that never left my side. I did not yet understand that this emptiness was preparing me, that the silence forced upon me would one day teach me how to listen, that the question my brother asked, so simple, so dangerous, would become the doorway through which my soul would eventually step toward light. But at that time, all I knew was this. In a land where asking why could erase a person, I had learned to ask it only inside my heart. And even that felt like rebellion. By the time I turned 28, my life had narrowed into a single exhausting rhythm. Work, hunger, silence, sleep. I worked as a loader at the port, lifting heavy sacks from dawn until my muscles burned and my thoughts went numb. The sea was always there, gray and indifferent, stretching beyond borders I was not allowed to imagine. We were told it existed only to serve the state, just like us. That morning felt no different from any other. A shipment of coal had arrived from near the Chinese border, and we were ordered to unload it quickly. Coal dust coated my skin, my hair, my lungs. As I lifted one sack that had split open, something hard struck my hand from inside. My heart jumped. I froze for a second, then glanced around. The guards were shouting at another group, their attention elsewhere. I reached inside the torn sack and felt a small object wrapped tightly in plastic. In that instant, fear flooded my body. Forbidden objects meant arrest. Arrest meant interrogation. Interrogation meant disappearance. Every instinct told me to call a guard immediately. That was what loyal citizens did. That was what kept families alive. But something stopped me. Maybe it was my brother's unanswered question. Maybe it was the years of quiet rebellion growing inside me. Or maybe, though I did not yet have the words for it, it was Allah guiding my hand. I slipped the object into my clothing, my heart pounding so hard I thought others could hear it. All day I worked in terror, expecting at any moment to be searched, exposed, dragged away. But the moment never came. That night, after my parents had fallen asleep, I locked myself in the smallest corner of our apartment and carefully unwrapped the plastic. Inside was a tiny radio, no larger than my palm. My hands trembled as I turned it on, barely lifting the volume above silence. At first, there was only static. Then, faintly, a voice. Not the harsh tone of state propaganda, not slogans, not commands, a calm, steady recitation. I did not understand everything I heard, but I knew instantly this was different. It was a Quranic broadcast coming from outside our borders. Words about patience, about justice, about a creator who sees what is hidden And here's what is unspoken. I felt as if someone had spoken directly into the deepest part of my chest. For the first time in my life, I heard about Allah not as a threat, but as mercy, not as control, but as truth. A God who does not demand worship through fear, but invites the oppressed, the broken, the forgotten. Night after night, I listened in secret. Wrapped in blankets to muffle the sound, my ear pressed close to the radio, my soul drinking in every word. I learned that suffering was not proof of abandonment, that oppression was not the final word, that even in silence, prayers could rise. I did not yet know how to pray properly. I did not know the words. But I listened, and listening became belief. In a country where even thoughts could condemn you, a quiet voice had crossed borders, walls, and fear itself to reach me. That night, without realizing it, I took my first step toward Allah, and nothing would ever be the same again. After the radio entered my life, fear took on a new shape. Before, fear had been dull and constant, like background noise. Now it was sharp, focused, and alive. Every night I listened felt like walking on the edge of a blade. Yet I could not stop. The words I heard were feeding something inside me that had been starving far longer than my body. I became careful beyond measure. I memorized the broadcast schedule and turned the radio on only when the neighborhood was completely still. If a sound came from the hallway, my hand froze on the dial. More than once, I hid the radio inside a cracked section of the floor, my heart racing until the danger passed. Still, despite the risk, I listened. Listening had become necessary. A few weeks later, the second door opened. At the local market, where survival depended on whispers and illegal exchanges, I often bought small amounts of fermented rice from an elderly woman. She never spoke more than necessary. One day, as she handed me a jar, our eyes met for a brief moment. There was something deliberate in her gaze. "For you," she said quietly, "be careful." When I reached home and opened the jar, my breath caught. Inside, hidden beneath the rice, were tiny strips of paper. Each one was covered in extremely small handwriting. Quranic verses. My hands shook so violently I had to sit down. Possessing such words was enough to be executed. Sharing them could destroy entire families. I understood immediately why the writing was so small, why the paper was thin, why the words were chosen carefully. These verses were meant to be memorized, not kept. That night, I burned the jar and hid the papers inside my clothes. Over the following days, I memorized each verse, repeating them silently until they became part of me. When I was sure I knew them by heart, I destroyed the paper. Faith, I learned, must live where no guard can search. The verses spoke of patience in hardship, of light emerging from darkness, of Allah being closer than fear itself. They did not promise escape. They promised meaning, and meaning was something the regime could not manufacture. The elderly woman never explained herself, and I never asked. Questions were dangerous. Trust was built through silence. Over time, small signs passed between us, an extra pause, a changed price, a different route home. I began to understand that I was not alone. I learned how to pray without sound. No raised hands, no bowed head, just intention, just the heart turning toward Allah. Sometimes I prayed while walking, sometimes while working, sometimes while pretending to sleep. The absence of movement became my protection. In a place where mosques did not exist and even the word Allah could lead to death, I discovered that the human heart could still become a place of worship. My faith did not make me reckless. It made me precise. I measured every step, every word, every glance. But inside, something had changed. Fear no longer ruled alone. It had competition. Hope had entered the room. I did not yet know where this path would lead, only that I could no longer turn back. The silence that once oppressed me had become my shield. And in that silence, Allah was teaching me how to survive, how to believe, and how to remain human in a system designed to erase both faith and soul. Faith, once awakened, does not remain still. Even in silence, it seeks connection. I began to notice small signs around me, things I would have ignored before. A pause before a conversation ended. A look held a second longer than necessary. A phrase spoken slightly out of place. In a country trained to erase trust, these subtle deviations carried meaning. The elderly woman from the market was the first bridge. One afternoon, as she handed me my purchase, she placed it down in a way that seemed deliberate. 3 short taps. Then she walked away without a word. That evening, as I passed the same alley on my way home, I saw a piece of cloth tied loosely to a fence. It matched the color of her scarf. I understood. 2 nights later, I followed a different route after work, pretending to be lost. I reached a storage shed near an abandoned building. I waited. One by one, people arrived. Not together, never together. A man with a limp, a woman carrying empty containers, a teenager pretending to chase a stray animal. We did not greet each other. We did not speak. Inside, there were only 7 of us. No prayer mats, no Quran, no sound. We sat far apart, backs to the wall, eyes alert. One of the older men slowly traced a symbol on the dirt floor with his finger, a crescent shape so faint it could be mistaken for an accident. Then he placed his hand over his heart. That was enough. This was not a mosque. It was not even a gathering in the usual sense. It was a test of trust measured in breath and stillness. We did not bow. We did not recite aloud. We closed our eyes and turned inward, each of us praying silently, knowing that discovery meant death. I learned that night that faith does not require structure to survive. It requires sincerity. Communication among us was built on layers of caution. We never met twice in the same place. Routes changed constantly. Times shifted without explanation. Messages were passed through objects, gestures, and absence. If someone did not arrive, we did not ask why. Asking meant danger. Most of us had lost someone. A father, a sister, a child. Belief was not inherited. It was discovered in pain. For some, it came through a radio. For others, through a memory of a parent praying before religion was outlawed completely. For all of us, it came at a cost. We learned to erase our tracks, to blend back into obedience the moment we stepped outside. Loyalty to the state on the surface. Loyalty to Allah in the heart. It was a double life that demanded perfection. One mistake could unravel everything. Despite the fear, those moments together strengthened us. In a world that reduced humans to tools, we were reminded that we were seen, that our suffering was not meaningless, that Allah was aware of every whispered intention, every unspoken dua. I realized then that what we were part of was not an organization. It was an underground current, quiet, invisible, persistent, a faith that flowed beneath the surface, untouched by propaganda or punishment. And yet, even as that hope grew, danger grew with it. Because wherever faith survives in secret, fear sends its spies. And we would soon learn how fragile silence can be. Fear does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives wearing a familiar face. After weeks of careful meetings, a new presence entered our silent circle. She was young, alert, and observant. Too observant. She asked questions without speaking them, watched without appearing to watch. At first, we told ourselves we were imagining things. Suspicion was dangerous. Paranoia could destroy what little trust we had. But silence has its own language, and something felt wrong. Our gatherings became smaller. Routes changed more often. The signs we used were altered, then altered again. Still, the unease remained. One evening, as we dispersed from a meeting earlier than planned, I felt eyes on my back. I did not turn around. Turning around could be a confession. 3 days later, the elderly woman from the market did not appear. On the 4th day, I dared to ask another vendor if she had seen her. His face drained of color, he shook his head once and walked away without a word. That afternoon, I returned home to find a small scrap of paper pushed under my door. There was only one sentence, written shakily, "Run." I did not have time to understand, only to act. I packed nothing, There was nothing worth taking. As I moved toward the door, the knock came. Hard. Final. The door burst open before I could reach it. 3 men in state security uniforms entered my apartment, followed by the young woman. Her face was empty, professional. She did not look at me. They did not shout. They did not strike me. They did not need to. "You are under arrest for counter-revolutionary activity," one of them said calmly. "Religious influence, foreign ideology." My hands were cuffed. As they led me out, neighbors peeked through their doors, then closed them quickly. No one spoke. No one cried. Fear protected itself. At the detention center, the questions began. Names, places, methods. Who taught you? Where did you get the words? Who else believes? Each question was a blade meant to cut through resolve. I remembered the advice I had been given without words. Say nothing. Silence, however, has a price. The torture was precise. Designed to leave no marks. Cold rooms, stress positions, deprivation. Water forced into my nose mixed with burning substances that made breathing agony. They wanted me to talk. I wanted to live, but more than that, I wanted others to live. During the worst moments, I retreated inward. I repeated the verses I had memorized, not aloud, not even with my lips, only intention. Allah is with the patient. After hardship comes ease. I held on to those truths as if they were physical objects, anchors in a storm. Days blurred into nights. Pain became a constant companion. At one point, my body began to fail. Fever, blood, weakness. A doctor examined me and told the guards I would not last long without rest. They paused, not out of mercy, but calculation. When the interrogations resumed, something had shifted. Fear no longer owned me completely. Purpose had taken its place. One of the officers noticed. "You've found something," he said quietly. "People don't endure like this without a reason." He was right. They could hurt my body. They could cage my life. But my faith, silent, unseen, was beyond their reach. And for that, I would pay an even greater price. The journey to Camp 16 felt like a descent into another world. My eyes were covered for most of the drive, but I did not need to see to understand where I was going. Fear had a direction. When the blindfold was removed, what stood before me did not look like a prison. It looked like the end of humanity. High electrified fences cut through the frozen landscape. Watchtowers stood like silent predators. Dogs barked in the distance, trained to hunt escape, not criminals. Above the entrance, a slogan was painted in bold letters, promising re-education through labor. I would soon learn that labor was only a tool. The real purpose was to erase identity. The first thing they took from me was my name. I was stripped, shaved, disinfected with chemicals that burned my skin, and assigned a number. From that moment on, I was no longer a person. I was a unit of labor, a body to be used until it broke. The barracks were overcrowded beyond imagination. 50 women packed into a space meant for 20. Wooden platforms served as beds. If one person moved, everyone moved. The air smelled of sickness, sweat, and despair. At night, coughing echoed like a warning that death was never far. The routine began before dawn. Loudspeakers blared state anthems while we stood in formation, exhausted before the day even began. Breakfast was a thin bowl of watery corn porridge, barely enough to keep us standing. Then came labor. I was assigned to a quarry. 18 hours a day, we broke rocks with worn tools. In winter, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Our shoes were thin, our clothes inadequate. Snow soaked through fabric and froze against skin. Many lost fingers, toes, sometimes entire limbs. Those who collapsed were dragged away. They never returned. Death was common, almost routine. What shocked me most was not the brutality, but the way it was normalized. Guards spoke of death as correction, hunger as discipline, pain as education. Humanity was treated as a flaw that needed removal. And yet, faith survived. In whispers that were never spoken, in glances held too long, in symbols scratched briefly into dirt and erased immediately, believers found each other. One night, an older woman approached my sleeping place. She leaned close, her voice barely a breath. "Allah sees," she said. That was all. From that moment, we understood. We met only in pairs. Never the same time, never the same place. We shared memorized verses without words, through gestures, patterns, timing. Faith became movement, not speech. There was no prayer mat, no direction of prayer we could openly face. But intention replaced everything. We prayed while lifting stones, while freezing, while bleeding. Our bodies were trapped, but our hearts bowed freely. Camp 16 was designed to crush belief. Instead, it refined it. In that place of extreme darkness, I learned something I'd never known before. When everything is taken from you, food, name, dignity, faith becomes lighter, purer, and stronger. They controlled our bodies, but Allah held our souls. And that was something no fence, no tower, no camp could ever contain. Time in Camp 16 did not move forward. It pressed down. Days blended into one another until memory itself became unreliable. I stopped counting weeks. I measured life in survival. Another morning stood upright, another night still breathing. I no longer imagined freedom. Hope, if allowed to wander too far, could become a weakness. Then, without warning, something shifted. It began subtly. Guards whispered more than usual. Documents were burned instead of filed. Officers moved through the camp with visible tension, their authority edged with urgency. Even prisoners sensed it. Something unseen was approaching, and fear had changed sides. One morning, while I was breaking rocks in the quarry, a guard called out my number. Individual summons during labor hours rarely meant anything good. My legs trembled as I followed him, expecting punishment, interrogation, or death. Instead of the usual corridors, he led me to the administrative building, a place ordinary prisoners never entered. Inside, the camp director sat behind a metal desk. Two unfamiliar officers stood beside him, their uniforms different, their eyes cold and assessing. "Your labor has partially atoned for your crimes," the director said flatly. "You have been selected for conditional release." The words did not make sense. Release was not part of our reality. 15 years was my sentence. I had served only 3. I stood frozen, unable to speak. "You will sign a confession," he continued, sliding papers toward me. "You will express gratitude to the leadership for mercy. You will never speak of what you have seen. If you do, your family will pay the price." My hand shook as I signed. The signature did not feel like freedom. It felt like walking on thin ice, knowing it could crack at any moment. That same day, I was removed from the barracks. No goodbyes were allowed, no final glances. I carried the weight of those left behind heavier than the chains I had worn. As I passed through the gate, one young guard, one who had occasionally shown small kindness, looked at me and whispered, "Pray." It was the only farewell that mattered. I was transferred to a supervised labor facility near the border. The walls were lower, the fences fewer, but surveillance remained absolute. I worked long hours in a garment factory, producing clothes labeled for foreign markets. We lived in dormitories monitored day and night. Weekly loyalty reports were mandatory, gratitude was required, silence was enforced. On paper, I was free. In reality, I was still imprisoned, only now the cage was invisible. I lived cautiously, retraining my face to show obedience. My faith retreated deeper, hidden behind layers of discipline and fear. I prayed without movement, without words, just intention, as I had learned in the camp. Yet even there, Allah's plan continued quietly. I noticed broken people like myself, women with hollow eyes, men who startled at footsteps. Survivors. Some asked me how I slept, how I endured. I did not answer directly. Truth must be offered carefully, like light, to eyes long kept in darkness. I did not know yet that this halfway freedom was not the end. It was preparation. Because sometimes Allah opens a door just enough to show you that escape is possible, and then asks if you are willing to walk through it, even when the cost could be everything. The idea of escape did not arrive like hope. It arrived like fear. A different kind of fear, sharper, heavier, because now there was something to lose. Inside the supervised facility, I had learned how to survive again. Not live, but exist. Escape meant risking not only my life, but the lives of anyone connected to me. In my country, freedom was never an individual matter. Punishment traveled through bloodlines. The message came without warning. During one of our rare, authorized visits to the local market, I was examining fabric at a supplier's stall when I felt something slip into my pocket. I did not react. Reacting could reveal everything. That night, locked inside the bathroom with the fan running, I unfolded the paper. The words were simple and terrifying. If you want real freedom, be at the loading area on Thursday at dusk. I stared at the paper for a long time before destroying it. Sleep did not come that night, or the next. My mind replayed every consequence. Capture meant immediate return to the camp or execution. Worse, it meant collective punishment for others. The weight of that possibility crushed my chest. I prayed as I had learned to pray, without sound, without movement, not asking for safety, asking for clarity. The answer did not come as a voice, it came as conviction. I understood that my survival was no longer only about me. If I escaped, I could speak. I could remember. I could become a witness for those still buried behind fences and lies. Silence had protected me for years. Now, silence was the enemy. On Thursday, my body moved before my fear could stop it. At dusk, the loading area buzzed with controlled chaos. Trucks, guards, paperwork, shouting. I followed instructions exactly, keeping my face blank, my steps ordinary. When the supervisor turned away, the man from the market nodded once, barely noticeable. Fabric was shifted. A space appeared. I climbed inside the truck. The darkness closed around me instantly. The smell of cloth and dust filled my lungs. Every bump felt like exposure. Every pause felt like discovery. At checkpoints, voices shouted orders, dogs barked nearby. I pressed my face into the fabric, slowing my breath, reciting verses in my heart to keep panic from betraying me. Hours passed, or minutes. Time lost meaning. Then the truck stopped for longer than before. Silence followed. The engine turned off. I heard a whispered command. Movement. Cool air touched my face. "You're across," the man said. I did not understand at first. Then I saw it. The river. Dark, narrow, indifferent. The border. Crossing it meant everything changed. Going back was no longer possible. I stepped into the water. It was freezing. My legs shook, but I did not stop. Halfway across, I felt the current pull hard, as if testing my resolve. I nearly fell. In that moment, I thought of the women in the camp, of those still praying in silence, of faith that had survived torture. I kept moving. When my feet touched the other side, I collapsed, not in triumph, in exhaustion and disbelief. I had crossed the line between life as a prisoner and life as a fugitive. Freedom did not feel safe, it felt fragile. I was alive but hunted, and my journey was far from over. Freedom did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, each one fragile, uncertain, and paid for with fear. After crossing the river, I spent months hiding, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to be remembered. Safety was temporary. Trust was dangerous. Even across the border, the shadow of the regime stretched far. Capture would have meant forced return, and punishment far worse than before. During those months, I learned a new form of patience. Survival required silence, restraint, and constant vigilance. I could not speak openly. I could not reveal who I was or where I came from, yet inside me something had changed permanently. The faith that had grown in darkness was now asking for purpose in the light. In 2023, through a network that protected refugees like me, I finally reached a free land. The moment I arrived, I expected joy. Instead, I felt overwhelmed. Lights, noise, crowds, abundance, everything felt unreal. I woke at night convinced I was still in the camp, still counting breaths, still hiding prayers. Freedom was not something my body recognized yet. The first time I prayed openly without fear of footsteps or walls, I cried. Not because I was weak, but because I remembered those who still could not. Those who still prayed without sound. Those whose faith remained buried beneath watchtowers and wire. Healing was slow. The scars on my hands reminded me daily of the labor, the cold, the years spent writing verses where no evidence could remain. But deeper than the physical pain were the invisible wounds: fear of authority, fear of trust, fear of speaking too much. Trauma does not vanish when borders are crossed. What carried me forward was purpose. I began sharing my story, not for attention, not for sympathy, but for responsibility. I spoke for those whose names could never be spoken. I testified for those whose voices were crushed before they could rise. Each word I shared felt like a continuation of their silent prayers. I worked with others who had survived similar paths. Together, we documented testimonies. We supported new arrivals. We sent encouragement back across the border in whatever ways were possible, carefully, quietly, at great risk. Faith continued to move even where walls still stood. Sometimes guilt returned. Why was I free when so many were not? In those moments, I remembered what an older believer once taught me in the camp. Survival is not a reward. It is an assignment. I carry that assignment now. I speak because silence once protected me, but truth must now protect others. I live because my life can serve as evidence that oppression does not win, that faith survives, and that Allah sees even what the world ignores. Today, I still whisper my prayers out of habit. Some wounds take time. But I am learning to speak again, to live, not just endure, to trust slowly. If there is one truth my journey has taught me, it is this: they can control bodies, they can erase names, they can bury voices, but they cannot imprison faith. As long as even one heart remembers Allah in silence, the story is not over, and until every silent prayer can be spoken freely, I will continue to be a voice for the unseen, the unheard, and the unbroken.